Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today's episode, we're going straight to a question that every ambitious leader wrestles with, but very few people can answer clearly. Why do some people, even in the middle of demanding careers, keep getting better year after year while others plateau and quietly stay in the same place? Our guest today is Scott Young, a leading expert in learning and performance. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Business Insider, and the BBC. He's also the best-selling author of two of my favorite books, Ultra Learning, and his latest book, Get Better at Anything, is one of the most rigorous and practical guides to improvement written for the modern AI-saturated world of work. Scott combines cognitive science, real-world case studies, and extreme learning experiments to show that getting better isn't about talent or motivation. It's about having the right system. So whether you're leading a team or just sharpening your own craft, or maybe refusing to coast in the middle of your career, this conversation is for you. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome to the program, Scott.
Yes, it's so great to be here. I love this topic, and I'm very excited to be talking about it with you. It sounds like you've had a lot of great guests in your program to talk about this already, some people I really admire.
Great. Well, let's start by having our listeners learn more about you. What got you interested in this work?
I have been writing online about learning and education for about 2 decades. It started as a student. I was trying to figure out learning for my own sake. So how do you do well in exams? What are the principles for learning? And I was sharing those with readers. And that started to build me a following. After I graduated, I did a few public learning projects. One of them was the MIT Challenge, where I was trying to learn MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum through self-study on my own over 1 year. And I did another project learning 4 different languages in a year. I went with a friend traveling around the world, and we went to Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea, learning those languages. And the crux of that project was that we weren't going to speak English. So these sort of extreme, what I call ultra learning projects, where you're doing intensive self-education, formed the basis of my first book, Ultra Learning. And the kind of starting to peel back behind the science of learning in that book kind of whetted my appetite. And that led to the second book, Get Better at Anything, which is a much more research-based book about basically what is the science of how learning works, because this has been my entire life's work of career of understanding how learning works, how progress works, and trying to understand it both from a personal perspective as well as from a research scientific perspective.
Thank you for providing that background. And it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart and what I do as well. And let's jump right into the book, because I love the story that you lead off the introduction with. And you tell the story about why it took so long for Tetris players to get really better, even though millions of people were playing it for a long period of time. Describe for our listeners what was going on there, and what does that teach us about the three factors of getting better at anything?
I think one of the things that I like about this story is that it's not really a story about any individual. So I think we gravitate towards the personal stories, the stories of the great scientist or the great CEO or the great leader, and like what they did in particular. And I think when you focus on the individual, sometimes you neglect, well, what are the sort of fundamental ingredients that drive performance? And so I really like the Tetris story because it was a real good example of a situation where a game, Tetris is a very retro kind of game. People were actually quite bad at it for many years, like about 2 decades. They were like, compared to where people are today, nowhere near as good. And a big part of that is about the environment that they were playing in, that in the sort of pre-internet days, basically the way you learned to play Tetris was you'd read a magazine that would have some tips, or you'd talk to a buddy of yours or this kind of thing. But that was the limit on what people could do in terms of techniques and innovation and practice. And then starting with the internet, people started posting like videos of themselves playing the game online. And so not only were you able to document what you were doing, so it was like verifiable gameplay, but people could study what you're doing. And this leads to all these sort of like super weird techniques. This is a little bit getting into the weeds for some people, but the old Tetris game is played on one of those old NES controllers, which just basically has like a up, down, left, right button, and then like an A and a B button. That's it. It's just like that very simple game controller. And the right way to play it now is actually to hold it upside down on a thing and like you're flicking it like this. You would not come up with this idea on your own at all, but it's this way that you are able to essentially press the button like dozens of times per second so that you can make these maneuvers that otherwise would just be physically impossible to do with your hands. And So this is just very much an example of a technique that you really need to learn from observation. You need to be able to see someone be able to do it. You need to have descriptions of it. And this was something that was really enabled by the internet. And so if you see the best performance for the first 2 decades of Tetris compared to the last 2 decades of Tetris, they're just like night and day, the amount better people are at this game than they were before. And I mean, Tetris is a little bit of a trivial example, but I just think that this example applies to innovation in everything, that whether science progresses, whether innovation progresses within your company, whether your technique progresses, depends so much on your ability to see what other people are doing so you can learn from the best available techniques, your ability to get good practice, and your ability to get feedback so that you can correct from your mistakes. And so once those three ingredients are in place, you can have steady growth. But if those ingredients are not in place, even if you have dedicated performers, the geniuses of the world, you have talent, motivation, all this kind of stuff, progress isn't necessarily going to happen. And so that was an example that really stuck with me when I first heard it and became kind of the basis for this book of exploring what are those factors that allow people to learn or hold them back.
Love that story. And the broader lesson is that effort alone just automates what you're already doing. Improvement only happens when examples, structured practice, and feedback interact, like you state. A question that I get asked a lot, especially in this with the advent of AI and technology, is does getting better at anything and learning, does that still matter? Because we have technology that does so much for us now.
It's difficult to make really strong predictions about AI and where things are going to go in the future because there's such large confidence intervals. Like there's a lot of people who think that current AI that already exists is just hype. It's not even good at what it does that they're saying to do right now, and it's not going to get any better. And then there's other people that it's almost messianic. They're like, we're all going to be out of a job and there's going to be our robot overlords taking over soon. So it's very difficult to say exactly what's going to happen in the future. But with some humility, I think one thing that we can say for certain is that if there is going to be a place for regular people to be doing regular jobs, which I think is more likely than not, then it is probably going to be the case that what artificial intelligence is going to do is it's going to be like any other technological development that we've had, that it is going to offload some of the things that are currently done with human cognition into sort of machine intelligence. Generally that speaking, for most technologies, at least over the information technologies over the last several decades, has been automating of the simpler, lower level work. So you can think about this in bookkeepers. You used to actually have to do the math yourself and you're writing it in an actual book. And then you got spreadsheet programs that would do this for you, right? So an accountant's job went from being really good at counting to understanding the formulas, being meticulous about record keeping and this kind of stuff. And so I think in a similar way, we're going to be, when we're facing with artificial intelligence, I don't think that the likely future is that there's no point learning anything because the machine's going to do your job for you entirely. But rather, you're going to have to learn to work with this and learn to supplement what are the things that artificial intelligence is not very good at. And so if you view it from this light, like any other technological change, in some ways it puts more emphasis on learning and practice and development than it did before. Because, just in the same way that if you were pretty decent at doing the calculations and you didn't make mistakes when you were writing things down on paper, like that was maybe good enough to be the accountant in the old days. Now you actually have to create these PowerPoint presentations, spreadsheets, and do data analysis and all this kind of stuff that because these new technologies have enabled it. I think similarly, when we're in a world where, like, let's say instead of having one programmer write every line of code, you have one programmer that has an entire army of agents creating code. Well, that creates this new skill of how do you manage all of these AI agents? How do you integrate all the work they're doing? And so I think the art of learning, the art of getting better at things, understanding the science behind it is going to be even more pressing as the technology is shifting.
I love that. I completely agree. Learning matters more now, not less. And instead of learning just to store facts, people now need to learn how to design systems, work with AI tools, and integrate that feedback from complex environments and continually update their methods. So the message that I take away is AI doesn't eliminate the need to learn. It just changes the curriculum of what's worth learning.
Yeah. And it changes also, I would say, sometimes the emphasis on things. So, I was having a recent series of articles on my website where I was talking about how much AI has penetrated software development, because that's one of the early use cases. And I was having many conversations with experienced programmers. And the sort of general takeaway I took from those conversations is that almost all programmers are using these agents to do a lot of coding for them. But what the best programmers are realizing is that they have to really manage it. And They still have to have good taste for what makes a good design, good solution. This kind of code's good, this kind of code's bad. Whereas the junior devs who are at the beginning don't have that. And so the AI is just kind of doing their entire job. And so if you take this metaphor and assume that this is something that will hold for other careers, what it shows is that in some ways it makes it more important, more like it's a stronger impetus on you to be really good at what you do, because the kind of mediocre work, maybe AI will be doing some of that. So I would expect in many professions, I know we've seen this even in things like, let's say, machine translation, an early era of automation, where translators right now, you can get pretty good translation from Google or ChatGPT or one of these things, and that's being used for these sort of regular cases. The people who are still employed as translators are largely doing things like legal documents and technical work and things where having that extreme precision of knowing exactly how to translate this exact word is really important, because maybe millions of dollars are on the line. And if there's a hallucination about what a word means, it can be too risky for a business. Whereas the person who's doing the takeout menu, that can just be done with translation. And so I think with this shifting environment, it may be in an environment where I was kind of indicating with ultra learning that the sort of general pace of technology has meant that in some ways we have to learn even more. We have to have higher levels of skills. We have to be at the peak of our professions, because the lower level kind of entry level stuff is going to be starting to be automated away.
That's an important distinction. You're right. You've been thinking about this space for a long time, not just in theory, but through your own experiments. What did you learn about learning throughout your learning journey as documented in that book?
I think it's interesting to see how you find so many parallels when you engage in kind of the theory and the practice and how they merge together. So for me, I think one of the things that I became really clear when I was doing these projects, like I mentioned in the introduction, the sort of the learning the MIT courses and learning the languages, is the value of having clear goals and structured practice. And so oftentimes when we're struggling to learn or we're not making progress the way we would like, it's because we haven't set up our environment. We haven't set up the context of what we're working on to fuel that growth. So we just have this sense, we're a little bit like the golfer who shows up and does 9 holes every day. And you're like, oh, why am I not really getting any better? Why is my handicap not changing very much year after year? And it's because you've sort of done enough to sustain your progress in this space, but you haven't created, let's say, a a project where you're trying to deliberately improve at golf. Funnily enough, I have a friend who decided to do just that. He had read one of my books and he's like, I'm going to do this for getting good at golf. And he was looking online. He's like finding all these golf methodologies for how people improve at golf when they're really good at it. Like, how do you analyze your game so you can figure out where's the places where you can get the most points deducted. So actually it's at this amount of yards that's where I really need to improve. So you do a lot of deliberate practice chipping it out of that 90-yard range or this kind of thing. And so this is, I think, the thing that's often missing in our professional lives. We're so busy, we're so sort of dealing with the exigencies of the moment that we have to get this project delivered, that we're like the golfer who's just showing up every day, and we're not always paying attention to what are the processes that are going to make us excellent at this or really level us up in such a way that is going to, not just deal with this current situation, but give us a foundation for skills in the future.
And I've seen that as well. And another lesson I took from your first book was structure matters more than motivation. Projects that worked did so because they built schedules, constraints, and milestones, not just because you woke up every day feeling inspired. And in a sense, get better at anything is more of a general framework that grew out of those experiments instead of just focusing on extreme one off projects. This book distills more of the principles anyone can apply to everyday improvement in their craft.
I think to me, one of the major differences was that when I was going through ultra learning, it's a little bit like you start with the stuff you're most familiar with. And I would say things like learning courses and learning languages, and they can be quite challenging for a lot of people. But in some ways, they're the sort of well-behaved learning examples. They're the things where to get good at them, there's just sort of a matter of doing the work, right? So I would argue that for most people, if you are sufficiently dedicated and you have a reasonable strategy for practicing, you could learn another language, you could learn another degree. Not to say it would be easy, but there would be a protocol for doing it. It wouldn't be mysterious. But so many of the things that we want to improve in ourselves are things that are just very hard to pin down in that way. It could be things like, well, I need to get better at public speaking, for instance, or I need to get better at really understanding my clients, or I need to understand, I need to improve in this esoteric domain where there's no classes or no kind of coursework. And so to me, that was this sort of drive to go back to first principles to try to understand, well, what are the things that drive learning in the most general cases? What are the ingredients? Because so often we're confronted with, like, I'd like to get better, but I don't know why I'm not getting better, or I don't know what, is holding me back. And so if you can understand those factors, then you can develop a plan sort of regardless of what situation you're in.
One of the most memorable stories in the latest book isn't a personal project at all. It's about a mathematician wrestling with an impossible problem for years. Andrew Wiles spent years on trying to just solve Fermat's last theorem, arguably the most famous theorem in all of math, but he didn't use a brute force approach. When you look at his journey, what does that reveal about how real experts actually navigate giant problem spaces compared to how most people imagine how a brute genius works?
One of the things that's like a really useful mental model when we're thinking about learning in general is introduced by the cognitive scientists Herbert Simon and Alan Newell in the idea of problem solving and problem spaces. And basically, what it is that when you are trying to solve a particular problem, you're trying to essentially find it's a little bit like finding a route through a maze. And the issue that we face when we're working on most problems is that the size of the maze is imponderably vast. So it's not the case that you can just go through it by trial and error and try every single thing. And indeed, one of the things that I think makes Andrew Wiles' story so interesting is that people kind of think, oh, problem solving or this kind of thing, there must be some sort of formula. There must be some kind of like, well, if you do it this way, then you will be able to solve it. And we already mentioned this sort of brute force approach of trying every single combination, even for simple problems that quickly breaks down. But once you deal with real problems in real life, the amount of possible actions you could take, the amount of things you could try is too vast. You can't do it. But there is even this very interesting mathematical proofs that all sorts of problems are impossible to write down a formula. And to me, that was that was fascinating because it means that you have to rely on what experts call this heuristic process of searching, which is that you are using these methods that aren't guaranteed to work, but it can move you forward, can chop down the space. And then on top of that, you're using also your expertise, your mental models, the patterns that you built up over time, so that you're trying to reduce the space of examples, the space of possible moves that you're going to make to pretty good ones. And this is true of things like math, it's true of chess, but it's even true of solving problems in business or trying to solve problems in any domain that you're dealing with. Is that a lot of what you're doing when you're learning is that you're trying to reduce the scope of possibilities so that you're only considering a few really good ones rather than this, huge possible space of opportunities. And I think if you can have that mental model of this is what we're doing when we're learning something, is we're trying to reduce the space of possibilities down to just a few good ones. It does provide that kind of hook for thinking about all sorts of other kinds of problems. What is the right way to acquire these skills? What are the kind of traps that we get into? To me, I think that was a real aha moment, because I think if you don't have that background, the inordinate difficulty of solving most problems in real life, then you don't really understand why certain things get stuck when it comes to learning, because you take for granted that, we're just getting better, like it's just moving up a scale rather than moving something from infinity down to a number of options that you can actually count on one hand.
I love how this story really contrasts the myth of that lone genius wandering in a vast problem space by sheer brilliance. And that's not actually even what happened. Instead, this genius, used strong methods and structural insights to prune that search space, not in randomly exploring more of it. And I love how this really ties back to leadership and business, because this scales to both, to leadership, to complex work. Real experts deal with giant, messy problem spaces, and they have to narrow them intelligently based on their accumulated knowledge, their community practice, rather than just being superhuman.
Well, I think that's the other idea too, is that to be able to solve, the more complicated a problem you have to solve, the more you have to rely on the sort of accumulated insights of other people. And I think that is the lesson of the Tetris story, that when we're thinking about were they able to be so much better at Tetris, it wasn't that the people got so much better, but that the environment allowed knowledge to accumulate, so that you weren't just learning how to play Tetris from scratch. You were always starting from what was the best practice. And I think that this is something that has particular relevance when we're dealing with the kind of knowledge in industries or the knowledge of business world, is that it's often not formalized in academic knowledge. It's not scientific papers that are bandied about. It's inside people's heads. And so this just shows how much your network and the people you can rely upon to like surface knowledge and insights is going to matter, because even the smartest person in the world, you're only going to be able to make this small contribution on top of what knowledge is already known. And so if you understand that best practice, you're going to do much better than if you're trying to go it alone.
Well, and this leads right into one of the core distinctions in the book, that the difference between weak methods that everyone uses by default and the strong methods that actually separate experts. Walk us through those four weak methods and perhaps provide us a reason why they break down when you encounter these large, messy problems.
Original study of problem solving with Simon and Newell, they found these heuristics. So heuristic is basically something that's not guaranteed to work, but it is like a good rule of thumb, or it's a good thing to try. A good heuristic, if you have tech problems, is like turn the computer on and off again. Like if you turn it off and on again, is like a good way to, like, it's a good thing to try. It's not necessarily going to work, but it works in a lot of cases. And so similarly, when we're dealing with these weak methods, they were called weak methods because they're not guaranteed to solve the problem. They're not an algorithm. They're just something to try. And they're fairly generic. So they work in lots of different situations. So generate and test is basically trial and error. So if you're not sure what the answer is, if you're doing a combination lock, you just try something and you try another thing, you try another thing. Clearly, this has failure points, but often what we're doing is that if you have a space of billion possible numbers, and if you can get it down to like 15, well, now 15, you can just try all 15, right? So this is often how we deal with problems, is to reduce the amount so that generate and test actually works, because it's a finite number that we can actually handle. Hill climbing is just basically the idea of how do you make something a little bit better? So if you have some way of measuring the quality of a solution that you have, so it's not just either success or failure, it's getting a little better, then you just make little modifications to it to make it better. So my best example of that is like when you're writing an essay, let's say. If you're writing an essay, you write your first draft, and it's maybe not very good. And the way that you usually do it is you just, go through it sentence by sentence, and you just make little tweaks. And each tweak just makes the essay a little bit better. And you just keep doing that process until you get something that's satisfactory. And the thing about hill climbing is that, first of all, it requires you to be able to like evaluate something in the middle. So like a combination lock, you can't hill climb because it's just all of them are failure except for the one that succeeds. So there's nothing you can hill climb on. But a lot of things are like that. When you're creating a business, when you're creating a product, that is usually how we deal with that problem space, is that you start with something and then you just keep making it a little better in various places until you get something that is quite good. The disadvantage, though, is that especially in really complicated spaces, if you start climbing one hill and it's not very tall hill, you can get stuck there, as opposed to where maybe the higher hills that you'd want to go in. So this is a very powerful method, but it has those problems where if you don't actually have the ability to evaluate the intermediate, so you don't actually have some sort of it's getting better feeling, it's very hard to do. And then also you can get stuck on hills. So this sounds really esoteric, so I'll give a real concrete example to make it clear for you. I really like the idea of how people learn to type on a keyboard. This is one of my favorite examples, but I would say that there's basically two ways people learn to type, broadly speaking. Is that there's people who've taken a class and they've learned to touch type, which means you use all four fingers on each hand. I guess you use the thumb for the space bar, and you put them on the home row, which is in the sort of the middle, and then you move them in a certain way so that you're using your entire hands and you're typing. And you can type quite fast. If you practice that really well, you can type, I know people that type 180 words per minute this way. The other way people do it is, I would say, a version of hunting and pecking, where they use two fingers, they add another one in there, but they're looking at the keyboard and then they're going tap, 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 tap with the two fingers. And that's the way that they learn. And the thing is that as you practice this, and most people do spend a lot of their time typing, you will get better at each of these methods. So if you're a touch typer, maybe you started typing at 10 words per minute, and then you go to 100 words per minute, 180 words per minute. As you keep practicing, you get better and better. That is the hill climbing. But if you are doing the hunting and pecking, you are also climbing a hill. You're getting better and better at hunting and pecking, but it's a different hill. So once you get better and better and better, you get to the maximum speed, which is, maybe 50 words per minute. It never spontaneously jumps to the other hill, because in order to jump to the other hill, you'd have to switch which methods you're using and get worse before you would get better again. And so this is a recurring theme in a lot of planning processes, that hill climbing is so powerful, but because it is so powerful, it can be misleading when actually you need to get worse in order to get better. You also mentioned, I think it was means ends analysis and planning. So planning is the simplest one. Planning is basically just, instead of solving this problem in real life, I'm going to solve a simpler version on paper and then use that simpler version to solve the real problem. And so I think everyone understands this, but maybe you don't think about it in that terms, that instead of taking the huge maze, you're taking a simplified version of the maze. This is going to be my strategy in general for solving the more complicated maze. And then means ends analysis, again, sounds really complicated, but it's basically looking backwards. My car is broken and I want to get it fixed. Well, I should get a mechanic to fix it. Okay, well, how do I get a mechanic to fix it? Well, I should call them on the phone. Oh, my phone doesn't have any battery. What should I do? I should get it charged. And so it's basically working from the goal and cascading backwards until you get what you want. And I think the thing about the weak methods, as I'm describing them, is that they are universal. They are not things that need to be taught. Our brains were equipped with these methods because evolution found them very useful when we're trying to figure out what is the right way to create a cognitively sophisticated entity in this world, was to equip us with these so that we could problem solve on our own. So I don't want to say there's no possible improvement there, but they are very general, and they're not generally things that need to be taught. In contrast, we were talking about the strong methods. The strong methods are things that are domain specific. So they don't work in every single situation. But if you learn them, they really help narrow down the problem space. So if you are learning, let's say, a Rubik's Cube and you're just doing generate and test, which is basically just twisting it and hoping that it comes out right, you can learn a method. And there are methods and tutorials for this is the right way to solve a Rubik's Cube. And they get you to look at certain patterns and this kind of thing. And if you practice it, there's teenagers that can solve a Rubik's Cube in under a minute online. You can watch videos of them. And it just shows that if you learn the right methods, if you learn the accumulated cultural knowledge for solving specific problem spaces, you can become really, really good at something, much more so than using these weak methods. But those methods are basically about Rubik's Cubes. So they're not as general as maybe the weak methods are. And that's sort of a major distinction in the cognitive science literature.
One place where you really upend conventional wisdom is around creativity. You're pretty blunt that if you care about originality, craft has to come first, and that worked out examples, copying, are not enemies of originality, but they're prerequisites. How would you respond to a creative professional who worries that studying and imitating the masters is going to make their work look derivative, plain, ordinary?
It's fascinating to me how our kind of shifted on this, because I think if you look at the backdrop of human history, and indeed, I would say non-Western cultures as well, the idea of this is the master's work and you're going to copy it faithfully has been essentially how most people have learned almost everything in human history. This has been this predominant pedagogical technique, and it is that way for a very strong reason based in cognitive science that we were just talking about, again, like you need to have this cultural knowledge. You have to be able to, like, instead of solving a problem on your own, if someone gives you the strong method for solving it, it's much better. But even more so, there's some very interesting research that's been done in the last few decades on how even if you could solve something yourself, so meaning that the way the problem's been framed, the space is small enough that you could actually just through trial and error figure it out. You don't necessarily learn it better that way, which I think goes against a lot of people's intuition. So a lot of people get this idea that, well, if I could solve a problem on my own, it's better that I solve it on my own than that I'm shown the right method. And John Sweller's work was one of the first people to really question this idea, and it's since grown into this idea called cognitive load theory. But the basic idea is that even if you can solve the problem on your own, sometimes you don't have the extra mental bandwidth to notice what was the nature of the move that you did. Basically, you're not able to generalize the sort of things that you did in order to turn it into a solution. But if you watched someone solve the problem, it's easier to pay attention watching someone solve the problem than it is to do it yourself. You're not actually having to manage the problem as much in your head. And as a result, you can actually learn the general procedure. The best example I can give of that someone might have some experience with is, I don't know if you've ever seen those little toys where they're kind of like, it's some geometric shape and they're like made of rigid metal. And the goal is to like slide them apart. But they're shaped in such a way that, like, if you just try to tug them apart, they don't seem to do that. I don't know if anyone knows what I'm talking about. They come in these little gift bags or they're like a little kind of dinky toy. And they can be very frustrating. You can spend like half an hour. You're like, okay, but it doesn't fit this way. And they're made of rigid metal, so you can't bend them. That's the temptation, is you want to bend them. And every once in a while, you'll slide it apart. And then you'll be like, wait, how did I do that? I was just tugging on it. How did it fall apart? Whereas if someone were to patiently be like, the key is that you need to do this, and then it goes apart, you would notice it immediately. And so, I mean, it sounds like we need practice to learn. We need to solve our own problems. I get that. But we underrate how, even if we could solve the problem ourselves, someone explaining to you what the underlying method is, or the general principle, or this is why this solution works. Once we can do that, we can generalize it, and that actually becomes a stronger form of knowledge. I think that the mantra in the West has been that we need to discover things from first principle, from experimenting. This was the sort of reaction in the scientific age, the Enlightenment era, against the sort of received wisdom of elders. By all means, that's very important, and we need to do experiments. We need to try things. But when we are learning in a domain, when we are going from a novice and we're trying to get up to that frontier, we need to do a lot of study and a lot of paying attention to what other people are doing. And so I think the best performers in a domain are those that don't just practice and do a lot of things, but they're also very keen observers of what other people are doing. And they're able to use that to generalize those principles so that when they do their practice, like we said with the hills, they're climbing the right hill in the first place.
That's great insight there, because you're right. The path is usually copy, adapt, and innovate, not just skip straight to originality. The real risk that people are talking about of being stuck in imitation forever is dealt with by sequencing, right? Early on, you copy a lot and follow examples closely. Later, you deliberately diverge from them by changing the constraints, the style, the subject matter, or the medium. So the message is that imitation is a phase of skill development, not a permanent destination. And skipping that phase is what tends to keep people generic and stuck.
Yeah, definitely. And so it goes back to what we were saying before about like you need to stand on the shoulders of giants. You need to stand on the shoulders of everyone that you've been with, but also recognizing that being able to really observe how other people learn is a real secret to our success as learners and as human beings. It's not all about practice. It's also about being able to extract knowledge from other people through observation.
Well, and you mentioned this too, as well, is that a big reason copying examples are so powerful is that they tame complexity and cognitive overload. Because you argue that complexity, not laziness, often drives learning failures. What habits should a self directed learner build to manage cognitive load without dumbing things down? And perhaps go into a little bit more about cognitive load and the intrinsic and extrinsic load.
So first, just some stage to set. What do we mean by cognitive load in the first place? Well, there's this very important concept known as working memory. Working memory is basically what are you thinking about right now? Think of this as, if I can use a computer analogy, this is the RAM. This is what's on the computer right now versus what's saved in long-term memory. So the basic observation from cognitive science in general is that our long-term memories are not quite infinite, but effectively so. We can remember tens of thousands of words in our native language. We can know the names of various people, know all sorts of information. All of our life experiences are in long-term memory. But we can only actively think about a few things at a time. And one of the famous papers that first discovered this was the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. But more recent research puts it closer to 4 things. So this means that you can have this enormous hard drive where you can store all the files you can want. But the things that you can actually load up on your desktop and actually look at the same window is maybe like 4 things. So it's very, very minimal. So the idea of cognitive load is that because this bottleneck for what we're learning is so narrow, we have to be very judicious in how it is being used. So one of the other principles is that outside of a few very simple learning examples, almost everything we learn has to go through this bottleneck. So you cannot learn anything that you do not pay attention to. So that's the first idea here, that if you are just doing something and it doesn't occupy one of those 4 slots, it's not going to eventually make it into long-term memory. So we all understand this in terms of distraction. So if you think about like, okay, I'm going to have the television on in the background while I'm studying some book. Well, you look down and then you hear something and you look up at the television and then all of a sudden, whatever was in your contents is just temporarily put to the side. And then you're loading up what's in the television thing and then you go back, but you missed a few things. You didn't save it properly and you have to reread the passage. We understand that, this idea of distraction, creating this kind of external load. It's this extra cognitive load that isn't related to learning. But what John Sweller, and I mentioned with the cognitive load theory, what he found is that often acts that we would kind of view as properly being part of learning are actually intrinsic. They're not necessary for learning, but if they are imposed on the learner in the act of learning, they can make it harder to learn things. If you have a diagram where you put the labels on the parts of the diagram, or you put them in a legend on the side. So you say like kind of like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then to like save space, you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The visual act of needing to like transpose the elements to match their label increases this external cognitive load because this is something you got to do in your head, use that limited working memory. And it means that you learn less when you see that diagram. Other studies show that if you present people the exact same information in audio as well as in a visual presentation at the same time, they actually do worse. So people think, oh, well, I should just read my slides. But if you have your slides and you're saying the exact same thing as your slides, then people actually do worse because they have 2 versions of the same information. They don't know which one to keep, and then they end up losing some of the information. This area I thought was fascinating because it just shows a lot of what learning efficiency is basically we have this small bottleneck where we have to get in knowledge, those strong methods, those things that we're learning about the world to solve problems. We have to thread them through this small bottleneck. And being able to manage that bottleneck and ensuring that what's going through it is maximally useful to us is a major part of solving the learning problem.
When you give some great examples and some great strategies in the book in terms of this to really to reduce the complexity initially, pre-training, isolate and master the sub-skills first so they no longer consume working memory, reorganize the materials like you were saying, rewrite those messy notes, reconstruct diagrams with labels integrated to remove redundant or confusing information, and use worked out examples. I'll focus on understanding patterns before jumping into fully open-ended problem solving.
I know a lot of people here, if they're in business, and a very common way of teaching is doing cases. And one of the things that always struck me is that the idea of the case-based method, I think, is it's not that it's not always helpful, but the idea is that we're going to present a situation and then we're going to just discuss it and have the students bring their ideas. But I always wondered why there weren't examples of people that we think are really, truly excellent business strategists. Like identify the experts, the people that we want our students to be like. and then do the case and show them what we would do, how we would analyze this problem. It just baffles me that that's not a more common style of teaching. Not to say that you don't do the cases in the classroom, but that they don't even start with an example. The idea is that, well, these students who have very little business experience, if you do it in your undergrad, and maybe if you do it in your MBA, you have some real world experience. And then they want these kids to come up with the solutions and just be, you come up with the answer. And to me, that's just a sign that, well, either there's nothing to teach here and there's no actual method, or if there is an actual method, then we should be showing the kids what it is. We should be able to say, this is a case, and this is how someone who is doing this properly, using the analytical tools, using the strong methods to solve this problem, this is what they would do in this actual case. And generalizing that, I think the students would learn a lot more. So these things do have practical implications. I know it sounds a little esoteric to talk about cognitive science, but really it impacts every facet of our learning and development when we approach things with theories that aren't really that grounded in the underlying science.
Before we wrap up, I want to bring this back to you, the listener. If there's one thing Scott helped us clarify today, it's this. Struggling to learn is not a personal failure. It's usually a systems problem. Most of us were never taught how learning actually works, how memory is formed, why effort matters. When you know how learning works, you stop guessing, you stop cramming, and you stop confusing familiarity with mastery. And you also start designing learning that holds up when it matters most. So, as you head into the rest of your week, don't try to learn more, learn better. Slow down, retrieve instead of review, practice instead of consuming. That shift alone can change how you grow professionally and personally. Thanks for listening to the Good Leadership Podcast. We'll see you next time. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.